Mist pooled like spilt silver across the lawns of Ashford Hall as dawn crept over the horizon, revealing the estate with a subdued solemnity that seemed to mirror the temperament of its master. The Duke of Ashford had never been a man inclined toward cheer, but in recent months his silence had taken on an iron hardness. Servants whispered that the burden of political disgrace, whispered about in London's clubs, snickered over in drawing-rooms, had carved deeper hollows beneath his eyes. Yet he remained outwardly composed, a figure sculpted from duty and ancestral pride, unwilling to let the world glimpse a single crack. Charlotte Harbury arrived at the estate on such a morning, her boots damp with dew, her gloved fingers wrapped around a modest carpet-bag whose faded seams betrayed its long years of service. She paused at the foot of the great steps, breath-catching as she looked upon the hall. Its vast stone facade rose like a monument to centuries of lineage, adorned with ivy and carved heraldry that seemed to watch her with judgment. She felt suddenly, painfully aware that she was merely the rector's daughter, competent with ink and knowledge, yes, but hardly prepared to stand within the echoing chambers of aristocratic scrutiny. Her assignment was simple in theory. She had been hired to catalogue the late Duchess's botanical journals, a task that required diligence, accuracy, and an appreciation for the quiet language of plants. The Duchess had been known for her studies, filling countless volumes with observations on soil, weather, and the fragile temperaments of flowers. Charlotte admired such devotion. It comforted her more than any ballroom or polite society could. Inside, Ashford Hall brimmed with restless activity. Footmen hurried across the marble floors, maids whispered in the corners about the unexpected young woman who had just arrived, and somewhere in the distance the murmur of aristocratic voices floated like a tide rising with gossip. Charlotte followed the butler through a sequence of corridors that seemed designed to intimidate, each lined with stern portraits and heavy, gilt-framed mirrors reflecting her apprehensive face. She was instructed to await the Duke in the library. The very room, she was told, that housed his mother's journals. Charlotte crossed the threshold, expecting an intimate space of quiet scholarship, but found instead a vast chamber with soaring shelves and dark-paneled walls. Light filtered through tall windows, illuminating motes of dust suspended like tiny stars. There was beauty here, solemn and elegant, and for a moment she forgot her nervousness. She wandered toward a desk where stacks of parchment lay in careful disorder. She reached for a small leather-bound volume, thinking it one of the Duchess's, when a sudden hush fell over the room, one so profound it seemed the air itself recoiled. She turned. There, framed by the doorway, stood the Duke of Ashford. He was taller than she expected, his posture severe yet undeniably refined. His dark hair swept back from a face marked by the angles of discipline and restraint. His eyes, cold, assessing, swept over her as though she were a misplaced object rather than a human being. Behind him lingered several guests. Lady Selwyn, draped in silks sharp enough to cut, Lord Rathford, whose smirk carried the promise of mockery, and 2 or 3 others eager for diversion. Charlotte immediately curtsied. "Your Grace, I—" "Do not touch me," he said, his tone slicing the air. "And do not presume familiarity with anything in this room." Her breath stilled. "I intended no. I will not have hired assistants wandering where she pleases." His gaze drifted, pointedly, to her hand still hovering near the book. "Or reaching for what does not belong to her." A ripple of delight passed through the spectators. Lord Rathford's smirk deepened. Lady Selwyn arched a brow, clearly savoring the spectacle. Charlotte straightened, mortification burning through her. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I was told to. I would never make you my Duchess," he continued coldly, ignoring her words entirely, "nor allow you to imagine that your presence here grants you any status beyond the task assigned." A soft gasp, sharp as a needle, escaped Lady Selwyn. Someone stifled a laugh. Charlotte felt the heat rise from her collar to her temples, each heartbeat amplifying the humiliation. She lowered her gaze, wishing desperately for the earth to swallow her. "I understand perfectly, Your Grace." For a fleeting moment, so brief she questioned whether she imagined it, the Duke hesitated, as though some part of him recognized cruelty in his own voice. But the moment passed. He stepped aside, allowing the guests to enter the library as though Charlotte were nothing more than an obstruction in their path. She retreated quickly, her steps barely audible against the polished floor. But once she was out of sight, the whispers surged. "Rash of her to wander. someone murmured. Presumptuous little thing, another chimed. Imagine her dreaming herself capable of catching a duke's attention, Lord Rathford scoffed. Charlotte forced herself onward, each word striking like a blow. She would not let them see her break. Not here. Not anywhere. She found a small antechamber near the servants' wing, sank onto a worn bench, and exhaled tremblingly. The cruelty stung, but beneath it churned something more painful. The knowledge that the Duke's words had struck so deeply because they echoed a fear she had carried all her life, that no matter her intelligence, no matter her diligence, society would forever see her as less. After several steadying breaths, she rose and returned to her work. She would not abandon her duty. If the Duke wished her gone, he would have to dismiss her himself. Hours later, as she sifted through papers, her fingers brushed a sealed bundle hidden beneath a stack of notebooks. Its parchment was brittle with age, marked with the late Duchess's distinctive hand. Charlotte lifted it, curiosity pricking her heart. Whatever lay within, she sensed it mattered. Charlotte spent the following morning in disciplined work, determined to bury the sting of the Duke's rebuke beneath ink and concentration. The sealed bundle she had discovered contained an assortment of the late Duchess's unfinished notes, raw observations, weather tables, soil sketches, and thoughtful remarks penned in an elegant hand. Charlotte recognized at once the outline of a larger study, one that hinted at solutions for the estate's struggling tenant farms. The discovery steadied her purpose, reminding her that her presence here, however unwelcome, might yet serve a meaningful end. Servants moved around her with sharpened curiosity. She was no longer simply a newcomer cataloging dusty volumes. She had become the subject of last night's whispers. Silence followed her through the corridors, broken only by murmurs that ceased the moment she drew near. Charlotte responded with a carefully maintained composure, for she knew dignity was her only defense against those amused by her disgrace. By midday, she had translated enough of the Duchess's notes to understand their significance. The land's declining wheat yields, long a burden on the estate, could be reversed using crop rotations implied by the Duchess's observations. The findings were practical, humane, and urgent. Charlotte considered writing to the Duke with a summary, then hesitated. His contempt still echoed painfully, yet she could not in good conscience withhold information that might help the tenants. She prepared a concise letter, modestly phrased, enclosing several pages of her findings. A footman delivered it to the Duke's study with a polite bow that carried a trace of pity. Charlotte thanked him regardless and returned to her journals, trying not to anticipate a response. None came. Hours passed in sterile silence. She reminded herself she had expected no acknowledgment. That afternoon, a luncheon for visiting nobles filled the veranda with bright laughter and the brittle chime of silver. Though Charlotte had no role in such gatherings, her workroom was close enough to catch drifting fragments of conversation. Their voices carried the polished cruelty of those confident their words would meet no consequence. Lord Rathford's scoff reached her first. "I hear the little scholar has taken it upon herself to advise the Duke on agriculture. Audacity knows no bounds." Charlotte's hand stilled above her notes. Lady Selwyn replied with delicate disdain. "Some women mistake intellect for authorization. It is unfortunate." Another guest added, "Perhaps she seeks the Duke's favor through diligent flattery." More laughter followed, indulgent and dismissive. Charlotte felt the familiar squeeze of humiliation, but it was the potential dismissal of the Duchess's research that struck deeper. She could endure mockery. She would not allow the late Duchess's careful work to be ridiculed by the idle. An opportunity to act emerged sooner than expected. The tenant farmers had gathered near the western granary for a council meeting, discussing worsening yields and rising rents. Charlotte knew she had no invitation and that prudence urged her to remain silent. Yet the Duchess had once attended such gatherings, and the work was meant for the tenants' benefit. Charlotte gathered her notes, steadied her breath, and walked toward the granary. The meeting was underway when she arrived. Farmers spoke quietly about failed harvests while the Duke listened with composed detachment. His advisers hovered nearby, offering little more than well-practiced sentiments. Charlotte stepped forward. Murmurs hushed. The Duke's gaze darkened with displeasure. "Miss Harbury," he said, clipped and formal, "this meeting concerns estate operations. Your presence is unnecessary." Charlotte curtsied but did not withdraw. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace. I come only to share findings from the late Duchess's research. They may hold value for those affected most." Unease flickered among the farmers, yet Charlotte continued. She presented the Duchess's observations on soil fatigue, explained the proposed crop rotations, and outlined practical adjustments the farmers could adopt with minimal cost. She spoke clearly, not seeking approval but offering knowledge grounded in evidence. Silence followed her final words. Then an older farmer stepped forward, removing his cap. "If the Duchess believed it might help, it's worth trying." Agreement rippled through the group. The Duke's impassive mask faltered. He regarded Charlotte with something more complex than irritation, perhaps reluctant respect. Lord Rathford, who stood among the attendees for appearance alone, released a derisive exhale. "You would entrust the estate's welfare to a rector's daughter playing scholar?" The elder farmer straightened. "If she speaks sense, that's what matters." The Duke's eyes shifted between his tenants and Charlotte. His jaw tightened, though not with disdain. "We will consider her proposal," he said. It was a small acknowledgment, but the weight of it settled through Charlotte like a quiet victory. As the council dispersed, a footman approached her with unexpected urgency. "Miss Harbury, His Grace requests your presence at once." Charlotte's pulse quickened. Whatever awaited her next, she sensed it would reshape her place within Ashford Hall. She followed the footman through the long corridors, the hush of the estate pressing in around her. Every portrait seemed to watch her passage with solemn curiosity, as though measuring her worth. Her steps echoed softly, steady despite the faint tremor in her hands. She wondered whether the Duke's summons meant reprimand or reconsideration, and which outcome she feared more. As they approached the eastern wing, she glimpsed the courtyard through a tall window. A group of tenants lingered near the gate, speaking with hopefulness, hope she scarcely dared believe she had influenced. Their trust, however tentative, strengthened her resolve. She had not spoken for her own sake but for theirs, and whatever the Duke intended, she would face it without shrinking. The footman halted before a heavy oak door. "His Grace awaits inside," he said. Charlotte nodded, inhaled a breath, and stepped toward the threshold. The weight of the moment settled on her shoulders, not as dread but as inevitability. So much had shifted in a single afternoon. The estate's fate, the Duke's regard, and her position hung in a delicate balance. She crossed the doorway, bracing herself for whatever she would find before her. Rain swept against the tall windows of the Duke's private study, blurring the world beyond into muted streaks of gray and silver. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting wavering light over a room lined with leather-bound volumes and maps of the estate. Charlotte paused on the threshold, her breath steady but her pulse uncomfortably loud in her ears. The Duke stood near his desk, one hand braced against its polished surface as though the weight of his thoughts alone could topple him. When he turned, the flicker of the fire caught the sharper angles of his expression, revealing fatigue etched into features that were otherwise controlled with unyielding precision. "Miss Harbury," he said, his tone neither warm nor cold, merely restrained, as if he were testing the capacity of civility between them. "Close the door, if you please." She complied, the latch clicking softly behind her. The enclosed space felt intimate in a way she had not anticipated, as though the study itself held its breath. The Duke regarded her with an unreadable gaze before gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. "Sit," he said quietly. Charlotte obeyed, smoothing her skirt with practiced composure. She waited for the reprimand she fully expected, rehearsing in her mind the apology she would offer while still defending the Duchess's work. But when the Duke finally spoke, his words carried an unfamiliar heaviness. "I owe you an acknowledgment," he began. "Your contributions today were not insignificant." Charlotte blinked, surprised by the careful understatement. "Your Grace, I did only what seemed necessary. The late Duchess's research deserved attention." He exhaled slowly, as though the admission cost him something essential. "Be that as it may, I had no expectation you would present it publicly before the tenants. It was a bold choice." "Boldness was not my intention," she replied softly. "Only clarity. They needed information, and I feared hesitation might allow the opportunity to slip away." The Duke studied her, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. And you felt compelled to provide that information yourself. Charlotte held his gaze. Yes, Your Grace. A quiet hum filled the space, punctuated only by the steady beat of rain. The Duke looked away, fingers tightening on the edge of the desk. I should apologize, he said at last, each syllable shaped with difficulty. For my conduct the day you arrived. It was unforgivably discourteous. Charlotte stiffened. The memory of his contempt still stung, despite her determination to rise above it. Yet seeing him now, visibly burdened by remorse, softened something within her. I accept your apology, she said gently. Though I confess the moment left an impression I had to work hard to dispel. A flicker of guilt crossed his features. I spoke rashly, he murmured, and cruelly. My frustrations were not yours to bear. His voice dipped. Nor were my fears. She leaned forward slightly. Fears, Your Grace. His jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he might withdraw into formality again, but instead he looked directly at her, vulnerability glinting beneath the veneer of composure. I supported several agricultural reforms in Parliament last year, he admitted. Innovations meant to ease burdens on tenant farmers. I believed in them, foolishly, as many of my peers argued. The reforms cost me influence, reputation, nearly allies I had known for decades. They branded me naive. His voice deepened. I am still recovering from the blow. Understanding dawned. Charlotte saw not merely a stern nobleman but a man shaped by expectations he had dared to challenge, suffering the consequences. The sharpness of his earlier cruelty became clearer. It had not stemmed from disdain alone but from fear that any unconventional alignment, even with truth, would corrode what remained of his authority. And when you saw me working in your mother's journals, Charlotte said softly, when you realized her findings supported the very reforms you had been criticized for. It unsettled me, he finished, tone grim. You, someone completely outside my world, had grasped precisely what many of my colleagues refused to consider. And you had evidence she herself never revealed. It felt as though everything I had attempted to defend was suddenly exposed again. I reacted poorly. Charlotte's heart ached with reluctant empathy. Then it seems we both fight for the same hopes, Your Grace. Different stations, but the same aim. He gave a hollow, rueful laugh. You bewilder me, Miss Harbury. The confession startled her, not for its content but for the way he said it, quietly, without intention to impress or intimidate. She sensed the truth of it, raw and unguarded, pulsing beneath the surface. The Duke moved from his desk, pacing slowly before the hearth. The fire's orange glow softened the stern line of his profile. I am a man accustomed to control, he continued. I rely upon distance to maintain judgment. But you, your intelligence, your resolve, they disturb the order I have constructed. Charlotte felt warmth rise to her cheeks but resisted the impulse to look away. I do not seek to disturb your order, she murmured. I know. He turned toward her fully. That, Miss Harbury, is precisely why you do. Silence stretched between them, threaded with unspoken tension. Charlotte's breath fluttered in her chest, though her composure remained outwardly intact. She sensed that something delicate and dangerous hung suspended in the air, and neither dared reach for it. The Duke stopped pacing and returned to the desk, placing a folder of documents before her. I would like your assistance, he said, his tone formal again yet lacking its former severity. Your understanding of the Duchess's research surpasses my own. I ask, if you are willing, that you help me refine a proposal for the estate's future agricultural practices. Charlotte nodded. Of course, Your Grace. They worked side by side for several hours, exchanging observations and debating interpretations. The rhythm of their collaboration grew unexpectedly natural, as though the earlier barriers between them had been lifted or at least thinned. The Duke listened attentively to her analyses. Charlotte, in turn, acknowledged his strategic understanding of estate management. Their differing skills seemed less like opposing forces and more like complementary strengths. As the night deepened, the rain softened to a gentle patter. Charlotte gathered her satchel, preparing to leave. The Duke escorted her to the doorway, a gesture that would have astonished the tongues of society had they witnessed it. Just as she reached for the handle, he spoke her name, her given name, not her surname. Charlotte. She froze, breath-catching. He stepped closer, not touching her yet standing near enough that she felt the quiet intensity of his presence. "Thank you," he said, voice lowered. "For your honesty. For your diligence. For your courage today." She swallowed, unable to fully steady her pulse. "You are welcome, Your Grace." He hesitated, his hand lifting slightly, as though he meant to touch her, but he let it fall back to his side. His voice was softer still. "Good night, Charlotte." The sound of her name on his lips resonated like a cord pulled taut. She opened the door with careful composure and slipped out into the dim corridor, her heart light and unsteady. Behind her, the Duke remained motionless, wrestling with thoughts he had no words for yet, thoughts that would not leave him easily. And as she walked away, Charlotte knew the fragile balance between them had shifted. Something had begun. Something neither of them could yet name, but both already felt. Winter descended upon Ashford Hall with a grandeur that seemed almost theatrical, as though the estate itself anticipated the spectacle soon to unfold. Preparations for the annual winter ball consumed every corridor, every servant, every conversation. The chandeliers were polished until they gleamed like crystallized starlight, and the marble floors were buffed to a mirrored sheen. Charlotte moved quietly among the bustle, providing occasional documentation about the Duchess's collection when requested, though most of her time remained devoted to refining the agricultural proposal now awaiting only the Duke's final approval. Their partnership, carefully measured, undeniably delicate, had grown into something steadier in the weeks after their late-night collaboration. He no longer avoided her, nor did he speak with the clipped formality he had once wielded like armor. Yet beneath each civil conversation lingered a current neither fully addressed, a tension composed of gratitude, respect, and something warmer neither dared to name. On the evening of the ball, Charlotte stood in her modest room adjusting the sleeves of her simple gown. It was not silk or satin, only soft dove-gray muslin, chosen purposefully to deflect attention. She had no intention of entering the ballroom. Her role tonight was merely to deliver a bound copy of the completed proposal to the Duke before his guests arrived. Still, she felt a tremor of unease. The hallways were already thick with the perfume of arriving guests, and laughter drifted like smoke through the doors. She did not belong among them, nor did she wish to. Clutching the slender leather-bound volume, she made her way to the Duke's study. Several nobles passed her in the corridor, none acknowledging her beyond cursory glances. She was accustomed to this invisibility. Tonight, however, every look felt sharpened by the echo of earlier gossip, whispers that she had somehow gained influence over the Duke through intellect or, more scandalously, charm. She ignored them with practiced dignity. The Duke awaited her in the study, dressed in formal evening attire. The deep navy of his coat accentuated the severity of his expression, though his eyes softened the moment they met hers. He dismissed his steward with a nod and stepped closer. "You completed it," he said, noticing the bound volume in her hands. Charlotte extended it with quiet resolve. "I wished you to have it before your guests arrive. Everything is in order, the Duchess's notes, the agricultural recommendations, and your strategies for implementation." He accepted the book gently, his gloved fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. The warmth of that brief contact startled them both, though neither acknowledged it. He examined the cover, tracing the embossed initials with a contemplative expression. "You have given me far more than assistance," he murmured. "You have restored a vision I feared I had lost." Charlotte's breath caught, but she composed herself. "Your Grace, the work is yours as much as mine. The tenants will benefit, and that is what matters." His gaze lingered on her, the firelight catching in his eyes. "You undervalue your part in this," he said quietly. "I do not." Before she could reply, the sound of music swelled faintly from the ballroom, signaling the arrival of the evening's festivities. The Duke sighed, almost imperceptibly, and closed the book with a soft thud. "I suppose duty calls," he said. She curtsied gently. "Good evening, Your Grace." "Charlotte," he said before she reached the door. She turned. "Thank you. For everything." She left with a heart unsteady in her chest. The ballroom shone like a field of stars trapped beneath crystal chandeliers. Gowns of jewel tones swept across the floor, trailing perfumes of rose and jasmine. Gentlemen in embroidered waistcoats circled the perimeter, conversing in pleasant tones that concealed sharper intentions. The Duke entered moments later, drawing immediate attention. Several ladies brightened with anticipation. Several lords measured him with appraising eyes. Charlotte remained near the periphery, unseen by most. She had no desire to join the festivities, only to observe from a respectful distance before returning to her workroom. Yet her presence did not go unnoticed by everyone. Lady Selwyn appeared beside her with a smile as brittle as sugar-glass. "Miss Harbury," she said sweetly, "I did not expect to see you here. How courageous of you to linger among society tonight." Charlotte inclined her head. "I am merely passing through, my lady." "Oh, but you must be careful," Lady Selwyn purred. "People might suppose you wish to elevate your position. Some have already begun to wonder why the Duke spends so much time with you." Charlotte held her composure, though her pulse throbbed painfully. "His Grace and I discuss only estate matters." "Is that what they are calling it?" Lady Selwyn's smile sharpened. "Dear girl, it is better to recognize the limits of one's station early rather than be humiliated later." Before Charlotte could respond, a voice cut through the surrounding hum with quiet authority. "That is quite enough, Lady Selwyn." The Duke stood beside them, his posture impeccably controlled yet charged with unmistakable tension. Conversations around them faded into whispers. "Miss Harbury's integrity is beyond reproach," he said calmly. "If anyone here misinterprets her role, it is due to their own misconceptions, not her conduct." A ripple of shock spread through the crowd. Lady Selwyn stiffened. "Your Grace, I merely offered concern." "You offered insult," he corrected. "And I will not allow such treatment toward someone who has been indispensable to this estate." Lady Selwyn paled, offering a trembling curtsy before retreating. Charlotte felt the ballroom tilt slightly beneath her feet, the force of the Duke's defense leaving her both warmed and unsettled. He turned to her, his voice gentler. "Are you harmed by her words?" "No, Your Grace," she whispered, though her throat felt tight. He hesitated. "Walk with me." He led her toward a quieter alcove away from prying eyes. Music drifted softly around them, a slow waltz filled with longing. The Duke faced her with a restraint that seemed strained to its edge. "I spoke truthfully," he said. "Your integrity is unassailable. But I must confess something further." Charlotte met his gaze, her breath unsteady. "You have altered me," he said. "Your intelligence, your conviction, they have challenged me in ways I did not anticipate. You see the world with both clarity and compassion. And I find myself—" He paused, as though the words caught painfully in his chest. "I find myself unable to remain unaffected." Her heart thudded. She could not move. He extended his hand slowly, giving her every opportunity to refuse. "May I have this dance?" Charlotte hesitated only a heartbeat before placing her hand in his. The waltz enveloped them, their steps synchronized though they barely touched. Every moment seemed suspended between propriety and something far more dangerous. As they turned beneath the glittering chandeliers, he murmured, "Whatever comes of tonight, know this, your presence has become essential to me." Before she could reply, a footman approached urgently, bowing deeply. "Your Grace, an express from London. Parliament requests your immediate presence. It concerns the agricultural proposals." The Duke released Charlotte's hand reluctantly. "Thank you." He dismissed the footman and turned to her one last time, the weight of duty settling over him like a shroud. "Charlotte," he said, voice low, "do not think this ends anything. I will return." She watched as he strode through the ballroom, guests parting before him like a breaking tide. The leather-bound volume remained in his breast pocket, close to his heart. Charlotte stood alone at the edge of the room, pulse trembling, knowing that whatever awaited him in London would change everything for them both, and yet sensing, with new and unshakable certainty, that he had meant every word he said. London greeted the Duke with a bleak, iron-grey dawn that mirrored the gravity awaiting him in Parliament. For 2 relentless days, he defended the agricultural proposal, enduring skepticism from landowners who feared diminished profit and politicians wary of reforms that threatened established hierarchies. Yet his resolve never faltered, strengthened by the quiet memory of Charlotte's unwavering belief that the reforms were both just and necessary. When the committee finally voted, the narrow approval felt like a victory pulled from deep water. Still, the Duke's first thought was not triumph, but the woman whose insight had shaped the proposal's very core. He departed at once for Ashford, the journey's hours spent replaying every moment of their last conversation, each word she had spoken threading itself more firmly into his conscience. By the time the carriage entered the frost-touched fields of his estate, he understood that his feelings had moved beyond gratitude and into dangerous tenderness. Charlotte, meanwhile, endured the days of his absence with a steadiness she scarcely felt, her thoughts circling incessantly around the dance that had shaken the foundations of everything she believed about her place in the world. She worked with disciplined precision in the library, cataloging manuscripts and repairing fragile bindings, yet every small sound in the corridor made her glance up, expecting his stride, his voice, his presence. She chastised herself for such longing, reminding her heart that affection from a duke toward a governess-born academic was little more than a fleeting indulgence destined to end in disappointment. Still, she found it increasingly impossible to forget the honesty in his eyes when he told her she had altered him. On the morning of his return, Charlotte stood at the library window watching the horizon when the distant rumble of carriage wheels broke the stillness. Her breath caught, though she remained rooted in place, unwilling to be the first to seek him out. The Duke, however, did not hesitate. He strode directly to the library, the leather-bound proposal still tucked securely within his coat as though it were a talisman linking them across distance. When he entered, Charlotte turned, and for several suspended seconds neither spoke, each bracing against a tide of emotion that threatened to overtake decorum. At last, he approached her, exhaustion lining his features yet unable to dim the intensity of his gaze. "Charlotte," he said softly, "it passed. The proposal passed by a margin so narrow it may as well have been fate's own signature." Relief flooded her so swiftly she gripped the edge of the table to steady herself, though pride glowed warmly within her chest. "You succeeded because you fought for what was right," she replied, meeting his gaze with newfound certainty. He stepped closer, lowering his voice as though the walls themselves might betray him. "I fought because you taught me to see differently," he said, each word deliberate, "and because I could not bear to disappoint you." The confession trembled between them, fragile yet laden with undeniable truth. Charlotte felt a room shrink to the narrow space between his hand and hers, and for one reckless moment she believed he might reach for her. But before either spoke again, a sharp knock sounded at the door, shattering the fragile stillness. The Duke stiffened as his steward entered, bowing quickly and handing him a sealed letter bearing the royal crest. The Duke broke the seal, scanned the first lines, and his expression tightened with a mixture of disbelief and dread. "It appears," he said slowly, "that the Crown intends to intervene more directly in matters concerning the estates, and they request my presence at Windsor immediately." Charlotte's pulse faltered, sensing the shadow that now curled around his hard-won victory. He folded the letter and looked at her with a tenderness sharpened by urgency. "Whatever this summons means," he said, "I will not allow it to sever what has begun between us." Though fear tightened Charlotte's chest, she lifted her chin, meeting him with the same quiet courage she had shown from the start. As he turned to leave, the weight of promises hung between them, urging Charlotte to trust that even scrutiny from the Crown could not extinguish what had taken root.